the things I thought was interesting in relation to this, that there is a recent research study that was studying these tiny shelled organisms. There's a picture of it here. It's kind of pretty. Called thorums, and they play this key role in food webs in the ocean carbon cycle. When they're exposed to high levels of carbon dioxide, of course, which there is right now because of greenhouse gases from fossil fuels, they ended up having difficulty building their shells, and they showed these signs of physiological stress. Okay, similar to the corals, that you saw in the video. And what they're predicting is this is going to have large-scale impacts, or the impact could cause large-scale disruption to the carbon cycling in the ocean. So that's really recent research. In your book, there's lots of really great figures describing these cycles. Of course, the carbon cycle, this is just everything's a cycle. It's how these things move around from the different animals and plants and in some cases rocks and soil, and this stuff gets we're mostly water, but we're carbon-based organisms, and so this stuff has to get around in some way because we can't take carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it into anything, but plants can, and we either have to eat the plants or we eat something that eats the plants in order to benefit from that. So vascular plants are responsible for most of the primary productivity on land. Okay. Similarly, in the marine system, there is a specific carbon cycle that shows you how carbon is moved from different organisms to different organisms through chemical processes and changing gaseous carbon, like carbon dioxide, into carbon atoms and elements that we can use in different ways. The nitrogen cycle is interesting because most of the air is actually nitrogen gas, and that's two nitrogen atoms that are linked together with this triple bond. And that triple bond is incredibly hard to break apart. We can't use nitrogen in its gaseous form, but we need it. So we actually rely a lot on nitrogen fixation by plants. And in most cases, there are these bacterial communities that live on these nodules of mostly leguminous plants. We're talking about soybeans and peanuts and clover. And they turn this nitrogen, they fix it into a form that can actually be used by the plants. You can get very complicated looking into the nitrogen cycle. It breaks down into ammonia and then nitrates and then into other forms of nitrates that are actually more easily taken up by plants. But this is the basic idea. And then, of course, we eat plants, or we eat something that eats plants, and this is how this nitrogen sort of goes around through the environment. So these are all things that we need. And I'll talk about, phosphorus cycle is interesting because most of the phosphorus is found in rocks, actually. But as it gets exposed to water and things like that, some of it actually, through weathering, actually leaches out and it gets assimilated into plants from the soil. We're not really made up a lot of phosphorus. We don't need a lot of phosphorus, but we do need some. And what happens is with phosphorus, it comes actually out into the cycle from the rocks, and it's thought that these single atoms can live 100,000 years being passed from critter to critter and around about until eventually this atom, if you really tracked it, ends up dead on the floor, and then it goes, turns into fossils, and over hundreds of thousands of years, it actually becomes this rock again that contains that phosphorus. But we've been able to, as humans, because we're so super clever, we can figure out how to break that nitrogen bond and how to actually get phosphorus out of rocks. And that's what we use for chemical fertilizer on fields. And so we've taken these nutrients that are normally in this system that can't be found, just like we have with carbon, and we have brought it out into the cycle. And that often causes problems, having that incredible amount of nutrients that aren't actually supposed to be there. Okay, I think I mentioned maybe I'm getting confused, but farmers rotate their crops. If you grow corn, corn's really hard on the soil. It takes up all the nutrients. It's really tough on the soil. And so they usually rotate it with soybeans, because soybeans have that nitrogen-fixing bacteria that then takes the nitrogen from the air, turns it into nitrogen, and when they plow it into the fields, it returns the nitrogen to the soil, which acts as fertilizer. Okay. So primary productivity on land and oceans is a little bit different. On land, you have this high productivity in wet climates, warm, wet climates. It's really high in tropical rainforests. The patterns reflect this global variation in climate and nutrient availability, as you might expect. And in the oceans, the role is not as clear. And there's high productivity near the continents, which I'll show you a figure in a second. And that's due to the industrial and agricultural runoff that occurs near coastal environments. You also get these upwellings in coastal areas that move this nutrient-rich water from the bottom to the surface and create these regions of high primary productivity in combination with those photosynthetic organisms that actually live in that photic zone and use the sunlight. So the primary productivity maps are right out of your textbook, and this is what you expect the primary productivity to be really high in equatorial regions on land, and then these hot spots. So these are heat maps of where primary productivity, the red means it's really productive. All along these coastal regions near the continents where there's a lot of runoff, you get a lot high primary productivity in oceans.